Recording in progress. Okay. All right, everybody. Well, welcome to ISO Chats. As you can see, we are all in the same room, which is really nice, except we've got some crazy feedback happening in the background. So I can hear my voice about 3 times, but that's okay. For those of you who don't know us, my name is Anne Hardy. I'm joined with Tamara Young next to me and Oscar Vorobiovis Pinta in the background. And this is actually the first time that we have been in the same room during an ISO chat. So we're very excited. That's okay. The other exciting thing is that it's actually the first. Oh, we've got feedback. Can you hear it? Can everyone mute my mic? I think it's yours. Oh, hold on a sec.
I think what's happening, Oscar, maybe put yours on mute or
no, it's coming from somewhere else. Is it? I think it's coming from ours. No, it's perfect now. Oh, okay. Is that okay? Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's strange. Okay. Anyway, I think it's better now, isn't it? Yes. Yep. Okay, great. So, sorry about that little false start. So I'm based normally at the University of Tasmania, and Tamara is at the University of Newcastle. Oscar is usually at Edith Cowan University, and Effie Stereopoulos is also assisting us, is based up in William Angus Institute in Victoria. But today we're very excited to be in the same room and celebrating our first birthday for ISO Chats. With Antonia Canosa, who's going to be speaking to us. But before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. Obviously, we're the 3 of us today are down in La Truita, and we would like to acknowledge the Muanina people of Hobart, the region from where we are meeting today. We particularly would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, emerging, and recognise their continuing and ongoing connection to land, country, water and culture. So we want to thank you all very much for coming along to ISO Chats. We've now moved to a monthly format. We're very excited about that. So today we have Antonia Canosa, and next, the next ISO Chats that we'll be holding will be on May 7, when we'll be joined by Heike Schanzel from Auckland University of Technology. Just before we kick off, just remember, if you could keep, it's really great having your videos on so we can see you all as we're having our chat from Antonia. We'll have questions at the end. Don't worry if you have distractions during it. That's all part of the ISO Chats experience. And please mute your microphones during so that we don't have any of that crazy feedback. We will moderate the questions at the end for you, and that's pretty much it for the introduction. I'm getting pretty rusty at it now, so we're going to the monthly format. So I will hand over to Tamara Young, who's going to do the bio for Antonia for you.
Thank you, Anne. It's so nice to be sitting and actually looking at you and having a physical human next to me rather than just an Oscar, rather than just my dog. And being locked away in an office by myself. So hi everyone, it's so fantastic to welcome Antonia to ISO Chat. So I will be just providing a brief biography for Antonia and a little bit of information about the presentation that we're all really excited to hear her present over the next half an hour or so. So Antonia is a social anthropologist with the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University in Australia. Antonia is a research fellow on an ARC funded discovery project which is called Beyond Safety, Ethical Practice Involving Children. She has worked across a number of areas, including children's rights in the tourism industry, youth activism for sustainable tourism and ethical research involving tourism. And I think the first time I actually met Antonia was at a conference when she was doing her PhD, and she presented on the ethical practice of children in research. It was absolutely fascinating. So we're really excited to have you here today. So her research is grounded in social justice and critical pedagogy, with an emphasis on participatory, ethnographic and visual methodologies in order to empower children and young people to contribute to research, policy and practice. And so that is all fascinating. I won't go too much into detail about the abstract. You can read that online, and I think I'd rather hear Antonia talk about her research than me. But what we're looking at today is children's rights in the tourism industry, and the program of research that Antonia works on that seeks to advance knowledge about children and young people's rights and well-being in diverse tourism contexts. So I'll now hand over the hosting and the microphone to a different location back up in New South Wales.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Tamara, for that lovely introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today. I'm a big fan of CHATS. I've been following CHATS for the past year, really enjoying every presentation. So thank you to Anne, Tamara, and the whole team, Oscar and Effie. I'll just try sharing my screen now. All right, can you see that? Should be able to see that. Awesome. All right, so my presentation today is children's rights in the tourism industry. But just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Araku people of the Bundjalung Nation, on whose land I work and live in the beautiful Byron Bay. So the background picture here is from a snapshot of one of the beautiful beaches up here. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So as Tamara mentioned, I'm a research fellow with the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross Uni. I'm working on an ARC discovery project that's not specifically focused on tourism, but it looks at ethical practice involving children in institutional contexts, so in schools, residential care facilities, and disability services. So many of the childhood studies theories and concepts are really fundamental to the presentation that I'll be presenting on today. So absolutely passionate about this area of research, which really extends nicely from my PhD, which was focused on children's rights, their safety and well-being when growing up in a popular tourist destination. So I actually did my fieldwork here in Byron Bay. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'd like to discuss today, 4 main topics. So in order to understand why it's important to have a rights-based framework when we're looking at children, human rights in the context of tourism, I'll give you a brief historical overview of children in research, and children in tourism research more specifically. Then I'd like to introduce you to some of the theories of childhood studies and this concept of childism, which I really love. And then we'll look more specifically at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the children's rights in the tourism industry. And the last topic that I'm really passionate about extends from my work with Article 12 of the Convention, which is the article that affords children the right to have a voice and the right to participate in matters that affect them. But before I do that, I thought I'd give you a bit of an introduction because many of you don't know me. This is a picture of a beautiful town in the south of Italy where I grew up, called Positano on the Amalfi Coast. And really growing up in such a beautiful place really shaped my research interest. Many challenges that were connected to over-tourism. And so it really shaped my research interest. Sort of I've been back and forth between Italy and Australia ever since, not sure where to settle. But I've been living in Byron Bay now for the past 15 years with my family and 3 children who keep me very, very busy. Here's another beautiful picture of Byron Bay, not to make you jealous. So I have a background in social anthropology. I like using ethnographic, participatory and visual methodologies to engage with my research participants. And I've done a lot of field work, specifically in Byron Bay and my hometown in Positano. My work builds on seminal authors such as Paulo Freire and the work of many of you in this meeting today, critical tourism scholars. So I'm sure I've cited you profusely in my work. I work from a childhood studies lens and also refer to literature in the space of critical youth studies. So absolutely passionate about developing this program of research, which really aims to promote children's rights, their safety and well-being in the tourism industry. So who is the child? 30 years ago, world leaders made a historic commitment to the world's children by adopting the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which will be really the focus of this presentation. It was ratified in 1989, and it's an international agreement on what we want for our children and how they should be treated as human beings. So the convention, Article 1 of the convention defines a child as every human being below the age of 18, unless under the law applicable of the child majority is attained earlier. So in childhood studies, the terms children, young people and youth are used interchangeably, but there's an understanding that childhood is socially constructed and culturally situated. So there's not one childhood, there's many childhoods, depending on where the child is growing up, in which country and social background. So let's look a little bit more at children in research. So children and young people have historically been marginalized in social research, and often their perspective and voices have been filtered by adults like parents and teachers. At the beginning, there was a focus on children within the family unit. But since the convention or the CRC in 1989, there was a real big shift in how we think about children. And so now there's an understanding that children are rights holders. There's been a shift from youth as objects of research to actual subjects. And the field of childhood studies has really been at the forefront of these new developments. So a move towards rights-based and child-centered research, which doesn't just mean inclusive of children's perspectives, but it's actually that radical shift that challenges the historically ingrained adult-centered assumptions that cause children's systemic exclusion in the first place. And so in tourism research, there's been a similar evolution, but we're kind of lagging a little bit behind. At the beginning, children were seen as too vulnerable and immature to participate. And I'm thinking in particular about research focused on host communities. So as part of my PhD, I had to do an in-depth literature review, and I was surprised to find that in tourism social impact studies and studies focused on host communities, children were actually excluded from samples because of this perception that they were too vulnerable. So often their voices have been filtered by adults, and there was a focus within on children within the family unit. But now there's really been an emergence of interdisciplinary research on children, and some great research from tourism academics on children as tourists within family tourism, and a little bit more scarce, but children as important stakeholders in tourism destinations as well. So I think we still have a lot to do to achieve child-centered and rights-based tourism research with children. But thanks to the critical tourism studies, I think we are now in a very good position to actually contribute some important research at the intersection of children, human rights, and tourism. So why is this important? I think it's important because just as we're trying to decolonize tourism research and advance knowledge that is inclusive of issues like ethnicity, gender, class, so too I think we should be progressing tourism research that is inclusive of issues surrounding age and the young. But to do this, we need a really solid theoretical and philosophical approach. And I've argued in my work that tourism studies needs to build on the work of other disciplines, which actually specialize on research with children, like the interdisciplinary field of childhood studies. So really, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. When we have all this great research happening over here, we can actually build on that. So I'd like to introduce you to this concept of childism, which I really like. Proponent and promoter is an ethicist and childhood studies scholar called John Wall, with whom I'm working on another project. So he defines childism is like feminism, but for children. It has emerged in the academic literature as a term to describe efforts to respond to the lived experiences of the third of humanity, who are children, through the radical systemic critique of scholarly, social, and political norms. So it's grounded in the critical and transformative worldview. And like feminism, post-colonialism, and anti-racism, it provides a real, an important critical lens for deconstructing adultism and patriarchy, and actually reconstructing age-inclusive research and advocacy. So I really think it's not enough to just include children in tourism research. We need to respect, uphold, and promote their human rights. And I think childism and childhood studies will give us a really solid basis to solve the big social justice issues in tourism. And I'm thinking about things like, is orphanage tourism ethical? How can children be involved in sustainable tourism planning in the communities where they grow up? Or how can children become responsible tourists now while they're on holiday with their families and later when they will be traveling on their own? So this is what I've been working to achieve both during my PhD and in my postdoc. And I'll just give you a little example of my work. My work is very interdisciplinary, so crossing over between tourism studies and childhood studies, but it's based on empirical work. And I specifically like working from Article 12 of the Convention, which promotes children's participation rights. And I'll be talking about this a little bit later on. So let's look a little bit more closely at what childhood studies is, because as a tourism scholar, it's sometimes hard to get your head around a whole new discipline or a whole new field of research. So childhood studies started to gain momentum after the convention. So it really took off in the 1990s. It's based on this concept of childism, which provides an epistemological and ontological foundation. It's a relatively new interdisciplinary field of inquiry and has been defined as a paradigm shift because it provokes new ways of looking at children in childhood. So it challenges notions of children as natural, passive, dependent, vulnerable, incompetent, and incomplete. So it promotes this idea that children are actually human beings right now instead of human becomings. So instead of being adults in the making, they're actually human beings right now. So childhood studies proposes that the lives, identities, and experiences of children cannot be generalized or universalized. childhood cannot be separated from other factors and experiences such as class, gender, ethnicity, which shape identity. And children, and this is important, I think it's often overlooked, children and relationships with close adults are really important. So the whole intergenerational learning and intergenerational relationships. And children are social agents. So the three main tenets of contemporary childhood studies are related to childhood, children, and their relationships. So childhood, as I mentioned before, is socially constructed and culturally situated. So depending on where the child is growing up, there are different contexts, different issues. We need to recognize their status and their rights as a starting point, not just for research, but also for policy and practice. And then this concept of intergenerational relationships and the importance of intergenerational learning. So these are the disciplines that have contributed to childhood studies. And my question is, where is tourism? So we really need a child-centered tourism scholarship that will contribute to this new field of research. And I think tourism studies has a lot to learn as well from childhood studies. Crossing over between the two fields of research would provide a whole host of synergies, I think. So why is this important for tourism? So many human rights issues involving children in the global south are often connected to tourism. If we think, for example, at things like orphanage tourism, the practice of visiting or volunteering in orphanages, there's a whole host of human rights issues entangled with this practice. If we think that sometimes these children are actually trafficked into these orphanages when they have living parents or family members that can care for them. So really just for the purpose of tourism consumptions. So this image here that you can see was developed in collaboration with UNICEF and Friends International, and it's discouraging the practice of visiting orphanages as part of the Child Safe movement. Other human rights issues, for example, child labour, so children often missing out on their right to education because they are selling trinket and postcards to tourists. And there's a really good study by Jenny Huberman in India that looks at this, this problem. But apart from the protection rights of children, I think children and young people have the potential to be drivers of sustainable tourism solution in their communities. And this image here at the bottom is a young person in Byron Bay that was involved in a project, a collaborative participatory project. And I'm working with young people in Byron Bay at the moment. It's a really exciting project because it involves them as co-researchers. So they underwent a whole training program to help us co-research tourism-related issues in Byron Bay connected with over-tourism. And they've decided to put together a promotional, an educational and promotional package that will actually educate other young people in the community and hopefully tourists as well. And it's in a creative medium of theatre. So it will be a theatre performance that they will actually showcase in the community. And through this theatre performance, they are hoping to lobby for more socially just and environmentally just tourism in their community, which is really exciting. And beyond that also, children can be responsible tourists now within their families and in the future. So we really need to find ways to educate children about sustainable and responsible tourism practices. So I think tourism studies has the potential to advance knowledge about children and childhood in ethical and child-centered ways that uphold and promote their human rights. So I'm going to get on to the rights of the child now. That was a bit of a big introduction to get here, but I think it was useful to really understand the significance of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it was a historical milestone because it really recognized the fundamental human dignity and human rights of all children. It's become the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history, and it's now ratified by every country except, I think, the USA, which is bizarre. Australia ratified the convention in the 1990s, and it's really helped transform children's lives around the world. So it affords children the same worth and rights as adults, so as human beings in the here and now. It sets out that rights must be realized for children to develop to their full potential. And it recognizes their evolving capabilities and the need for care, protection, but also their right to participation in matters that affect them. So let's have a look at the articles of the convention. So there's 54 articles, and they can be grouped in what is referred to the 3 Ps, provision, protection, and participation. So I'll give you an example. The provision rights afford children basic needs like health, water, food, environment, and access to education, those primary needs. So an example is Article 24 and Article 28. The protection rights afford children the protection from violence, abuse, neglect, trafficking, exploitation. So things like Article 19 and Article 36. And then the participation rights. Article 12 that I mentioned before, which affords children voice in all matters that affect them. And Article 13, freedom of speech and freedom of thought. So sharing thoughts freely by any medium, as long as it doesn't harm others. And I'm currently undertaking research in collaboration with some fantastic colleagues, Dr. Kate Van Doo at Griffith Law School and Dr. Harriet Beasley at the University of Sunshine Coast. I think Harriet and her students are in this meeting today. So we're doing a systematic scoping review of the articles that address children's rights in the context of tourism and volunteering. And we wanted to do this because in 2019, it was the year of the 30th anniversary of the CRC, and we felt it was really important to see what has been published in this area so far, so at the intersection of children, human rights, and tourism. We employed the PRISMA approach for systematic scoping reviews, and we used a rights-based approach to analyze the articles we found. So we analyzed 257 articles. We included 66 in our study, but only 37 were actually specifically focused on children's rights in the tourism industry. So we employed a discourse analysis to look at how children have been constructed in these studies. And we were rather surprised that it was only 37. We were expecting a whole lot more. And it was important in our analysis to distinguish between research on children's experiences of various aspects of tourism and research specifically focused on children's rights in the tourism industry, because we had to exclude a whole host of scholarship that didn't focus specifically on human rights issues. We were also surprised that the majority of articles were published in non-tourism journals. The main one was International Journal of Children's Rights, Children's Society, and Child Abuse Review. But the subject areas, as reported by Schimago, show that tourism does feature down here. But the main subject area was sociology and political science. So out of curiosity, I exported the journals that were published in Tourism Journal. So there's only 7 out of 66. And as you can see here, the earlier ones focus mainly on child sexual exploitation, and the later ones on orphanage tourism, risks associated with major sporting events. And this really interesting one by Jordan and Vertin in 2020 that looks at the intergenerational rights to sustainable future and climate change in tourism. So maybe this picture is a little bit small, but this is our rights-based analysis. So we looked at the specific rights that were reported in the articles, and if it made references to articles of the convention. And as you can see here, the articles that were most often reported were Article 34, Article 35, and Article 9, which deal with sexual exploitation, abduction, sale and trafficking, and family separation. So the main topics were child sex tourism, orphanage tourism, child trafficking, child labour, and child safe tourism. We're also surprised that the majority of studies were not empirical, so they were like policy analysis. And those that were empirical didn't directly interview children, so it interviewed other stakeholders. And also the majority of human rights issues referred to protection rights of children to be safe and free from exploitation. There were very few studies that actually looked at children's participation rights, so rights to voice and freedom of expression. That's why you'll find Article 12 is further down here in the list. So we can say that there's mainly a protectionist view of children's rights in tourism. And in the majority of the studies we reviewed, children are constructed as vulnerable and in need of protection. So excluded from research because perceived to be too vulnerable to actually participate, which I think is an issue. So why do we consider children too vulnerable to participate? As I mentioned before, childhood is socially constructed. So often what is deemed sensitive is socially and culturally relative. So I'll give you an example. For example, a 4-year-old peeling an apple with a very sharp knife might be unacceptable in a country like Australia, but it might be quite normal in a country in the global south. So I think we really need to overcome universal understandings of childhood and actually decolonize childhood itself. So we need to reimagine human rights in new ways, inclusive of children. That's why I've argued for a child-centered approach to human rights in tourism. So I really think that children will be included in human rights only when human rights are thought about and enacted in ways that respond to adults and children equally. So this notion that we need less child saving and more child empowerment. So children not as human rights objects, but actually as human rights subjects. And I actually just recently this week on Wednesday, I attended a seminar on children's participation in decision making. And I really like this phrase that Laura Lundy, an expert on children's rights, said, you know, vulnerability should not eclipse agency. So we can't exclude children from research, policy, practice only because we perceive them to be too vulnerable. And ultimately, you know, we need to promote more socially just forms of tourism. And I think the starting point needs to always be children's lived experiences. So we need to hear from these children, and we need to include them in decision making. But how do we do that? So how do we promote children's rights to participation? Now, the term participation can mean different things to different people. And there's been a number of typologies that have been developed to highlight the levels or layers of participation in various contexts and situations. This image here is Hart's participation ladder. So some of the rungs of the ladder might seem like participation, like the lower rungs, 1, 2, 3, might seem like participation, but they're not. So merely including children in a study without consideration for their participation rights is tokenistic in nature. Ultimately, I think we need to promote the higher levels of that ladder. We need youth-initiated participation and shared decision-making with adults. So in tourism research, this might involve employing participatory methods and involving children as co-researchers or in consultative roles, like on a youth advisory committee that actually informs every phase of the research. In practice, it might look like co-developing tourist attractions with children. So I'm thinking in particular about, for example, museum spaces for children. In policy, it might look like meaningfully consulting with children and young people growing up in host communities when those tourism strategies and plans are actually developed. So how do we facilitate children's participation in tourism research, policy and practice? And how do we promote children's rights to participation in matters that affect them? I really like this next model by Laura Lundy because it centers on Article 12, which is the article that affords children the right to participate in matters that affect them. And it sets out these 4 areas: space, voice, audience, and influence. So space, children must be given the opportunity to express a view. And I think increasingly we're seeing that if they don't, and the concern is pressing enough, they actually take to the streets. So we've seen, you know, recent climate change protests. So I really think that youth activism is on the rise because we're not giving them space to express their views. Voice, children must be facilitated to express their voice, but they also must be listened to and their views must be acted upon as appropriate. So they must have influence. And this model has actually been adopted by the European Commission, by, I think, the World Health Organization and NGOs like UNICEF and World Vision. So we really need to place the child at the center. And in order to uphold children's rights, I think we really need to develop child-centered research policy and practice that is grounded in the critical or transformative worldview. So this little diagram that I developed here was when I was doing my PhD, and I was arguing that research on host communities was actually marginalizing children. So we need to go from the silent phase to the youth-driven phase and actually meaningfully include children in tourism research by means of participatory methods. So we need to be sensitive to children's capabilities and their well-being, inclusive of diversities of age, gender, ethnicity, place and time. ethically mindful. I think that's really important. We need to be ethically mindful of the power relations in research. And we need to be methodologically flexible, I think, to be able to really elicit their perspectives in ethical ways. And all my research projects have been developed in consultation with children, either as co-researchers or as members of advisory groups. So I'll give you some examples. This first publication was from my PhD, Empowering Young People Through Participatory Film. I had no idea my co-researchers and my participants wanted to use participatory filmmaking. They actually, in order to explore tourism issues in the community, they wanted to create something called stop motion animation. So they created little clay figurines and made up a couple of stories that express their views. So this one's really funny. This one was created by a group of 5 boys, and they argued that tourists were littering the beaches too much, so they needed to put them all in jail, which was really interesting, a bit radical. And I've described these methodologies in a recent book chapter in the Handbook of Research Methodology for Tourism and Hospitality Management, so looking specifically at child-centered approaches and methods. Not to bore you, but these other publications are focused on my most recent work with the group of young people in Byron Bay that are producing the theatre performance. So this image is actually the cast who were also co-researchers. So they actually went out and interviewed their peers in the community, and they're developing a play based on the findings of this research. And it so happened that they were doing the field work during COVID, so that made it even more interesting. But you know, at the end of the day, I think participation is hard. That's why so many people shy away from it. I think in principle, children have important things to tell us, but adults sometimes are not convinced that children have legitimate views. I think children have a right to have a say, but then in practice, adults don't want change and don't want to share power. I think children learn to take their place in society, but adults often determine what being a good citizen looks like. So it's not the child that defines that. And also it's really important to remember that you know, childhood is about relationships at the end of the day. So children need supportive adults in their lives who listen and help them with decision making. So participation can be difficult. And, you know, sometimes children don't want to have a say, and that's fine as well. So how do we promote children's right to participation in matters that affect them in the tourism industry? I like this table because it shows that it's not enough just to listen to children. It's not enough to support them in expressing their views. And we're really trying to aim to involve children in actual decision-making processes, so level 4 and 5. We need to share power and responsibility for decision-making. So this diagram, this table shows that to actually implement the rights of the child as enshrined in the convention, we need to aim for level 4 and 5. We need to involve them in decision making. So how are we going for time? We're nearly there. All right, so just to recap the general principles of the convention. Article 2, principle of non-discrimination, so taking into consideration the identities of the child and, you know, across different ethnicities, gender, and so forth. The best interest of the child need to be a primary consideration in all actions concerning children, so Article 3. Article 6, the right to life, survival, and development. and Article 12, which my work really specifically focuses on, which is the right to be heard on decisions that affect them. So are we there yet? I think we still have a long way to go to build the tourism industry that really respects the human rights of children and young people. And I think we still have a little way to go to build a robust, child-centered and ethical research involving children in tourism. So I just wanted to leave you with this quote because it's a real eye-opener and important to keep in mind. So we live in a society and culture in which children and young people are generally not listened to, consulted, or involved in decision-making. Children say very clearly that adults don't listen to them. They ignore them, leave them out, interrupt, redefine, or override what they say. So it's really important to keep this in mind because as critical tourism scholars, we're trying to challenge the norms. We need to go beyond these common conceptualizations of children and childhood. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. Here's my email, my social media address. Love to hear from you and happy to take questions now. So over to you, Anne and Tamara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was a fascinating presentation, and there's many comments and questions that have come through in the chat, and what we'll do as usual is send them through to you afterwards, and you can read them individually and in your own time. But one of the most overarching comments that came up about halfway through your presentation, and I jotted it down as well, really related to the question of ethics and the bureaucratic procedures that many of us as researchers have to go through to get through to ethics. And I mean, people made some comments, but I was actually a bit more brutal with the statement that I made here, that I said the excuses about children being too vulnerable to be involved in research, that sort of comes out of the literature that you've got there. But I'm also wondering, is there a laziness on behalf of researchers to even go through the processes of ethics in terms of considering children in these, in their research? Because they go, that's in the too hard basket, so I'm just going to do interviews with adults. So firstly, what are the sort of ethical considerations or procedures you had to go through to carry out your research?
Yes, that's a really good question. I'll tell you a little story, because when I started my PhD, actually I had everyone around me at the time telling me, no, don't go and interview children, it's too complicated. They really tried to discourage me from actually including children in my research. And so I specifically sought out PhD supervisors that were supportive of that. And so I ended up with fantastic mentors and supervisors, the director of the Centre for Children and Young People, Anne Graham, and Erica Wilson, which you all know. So yes, I was discouraged, and the excuse they gave was the ethics process, and it's too complicated. It will take too long. It's going to take 6 months to get approved. So yes, it's I think universities have really strict ethical processes, but they are there for a reason. And in all my research projects, I welcome the strictness of those procedures, because it really helps you to think through every step of the research process. So it takes time, obviously, but it's not an excuse to avoid including children in your research, because you really need to think long and hard about how to implement ethical principles in your research. And I'm really glad that they do have those strict processes. What I've experienced at Southern Cross University is that you can be flexible in your proposal. So you can say, this is the interview questions that I want to ask of my participants, but actually I'll come back to you with a change of protocol after I've consulted with the children to see if the wording is appropriate. So you can do that, which is really, really great. And the ethics committee at SU are quite used to that because we do a lot of change of protocols for that reason. So actually having a sort of general idea of what you want to ask of the children, but then going out and consulting with them. And that's invaluable because sometimes what makes sense to us as adults, really doesn't make sense to the child. So I think that consultation is really essential, and ethics committees are quite flexible with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Oscar made a comment that he reviews ethics, and I sat on the ethics committee for a long time, and I think, yeah, and one of the things that I guess I can direct people to is the research that you've published does actually address some of these issues in, well, the questions about ethics, but also the types of methodologies that you did employ based on that co-creation of research with the children. Everyone's just telling you what a fantastic presentation. And we have Mona, can you share your experience about getting consent from children's guardians? Although we argue that children are not vulnerable to participate in research and they have a right to speak out, the ethics requiring children's guardians could impede research with children. So have you had any issues with that, with the parents say?
Yes, that's been a big issue in my projects, because at what age does a child? There's no age where the child progresses from being a young age where he needs parents to consent for them to a teenager or a 16-year-old that is able to consent on their own. So I think it's context dependent. It depends on the context in which you're working. If you're working with very young children, obviously you need parental consent. Whether you're recruiting them through schools, for example, or through families, it differs. Through schools, for example, there's an opt-out consent process where schools, do routine consultation with children anyway. So they might send out information to families and saying, if you don't want your child to participate in this research, please sign this form. That's called an opt-out consent form. But if you're doing research outside schools and you're wanting to interview children that are very young, then you will have to meet the parents and meet the families. And it's very relational, so you really need to establish those relationships with the whole family.
That's interesting. Sorry, I was going to say that's interesting because Han Lu has actually brought up a gender issue relating to the gender of the researcher, and that one of her master's students at her university who was male wanted to do research on children's playgrounds within Singapore, and was told that because he was male that could be quite an issue and that he might be seen as a predatory male research with the children. Have you come across that sort of gender of the researchers and the impact that has on children's research?
Yeah, I've read about it. I haven't experienced it myself, but I've read about it. And yes, it is an issue. I'm not sure how you could get around that unless you have a team of researchers and, you collaborate with female researchers, or you have actually children on your advisory boards informing your research project. So actually including them on your advisory committees. It is an issue, yes. I'm not quite sure.
It's just an interesting issue that Han Lu raised.
Yeah. Actually, my experience, because I'm a woman and I have kids of my own. When I was doing my PhD, my children actually tagged along with me. They were little. They were like all three of them were under the age of 10. And at the beginning, I thought that was going to be a hindrance, but actually it helped me establish those relationships with my participants. So maybe if you've got a child, you can bring your child along as a co-researcher. And
we were just talking about that yesterday, as babies and as breaking the ice in research.
We came a I think it was called Breaking the Ice. And it was by Emma Stewart. They just published it a few weeks ago, and she took her children along to do research in the Arctic. And
yeah. And I published a book chapter in Heike's book on femininities in tourism, and I titled it, "Mummy, when are we getting to the fields?" Because my children kept on asking me when I said, "Oh, we have to go and do Mummy's field work." They were thinking of the fields, the sugar cane fields, and when are we getting there?
Well, I'm going to take that as a beautiful segue to our next ISO chats, where we do actually have Heike Schanzel coming from Australia. Oh, sorry, not coming from Australia. Sorry, Heike, I know you're there. Auckland University of Technology, to talk about femininities in the field research. She's going to focus on a particular project that looks at women in the field. And later in the season of ISO chats, we will also be looking at some of the topics around masculinities in the field as well. So, as a big thank you to Antonia, can we all give a virtual clap? That was fantastic. It's so great to have everyone here. We have one.
Can you see that, Oscar?
Final announcement that we just wanted to say that Antonia is our first birthday celebration of ISO chats. We started this crazy idea exactly 12 months ago, and we just wanted to thank everyone for your amazing support over the last 12 months of this initiative that has really brought together some amazing tourism researchers, and we've had so many fantastic topics.
Oh, apparently I'm doing the wrong thing.
So we have a cake slide, don't worry. Anne, do you want to say anything? We're in the same room together to celebrate our first birthday. So thank you, Antonia, for being our
thank you. Look, thanks very much, everyone. I think, for many of us, ISO Chats has been a really nice way just to learn and also to connect. I know that personally I've been exposed to so many talks that I wouldn't otherwise probably have been exposed to in so many different topics. But the other thing is I've also met people. So many of you in this room, we've actually become friends, and we may not even have met in person, but just sort of knowing that you're there in the room every week and every month. Hello, happy birthday. It's been lovely. So thanks everyone. Happy birthday. This is as much about you coming along, because it wouldn't have been fun with just the three of us or us sitting in the Zoom room together. We do appreciate your support.
Thank you. 2 weeks' time is our next ISO Chats. We'll remind you on Facebook, we'll remind you on Twitter. If you don't follow us on Facebook or Twitter, please do join our group, join our community, join our squad, as my daughter would say, the ISO Chat squad. And thanks for being here today, and have a fantastic weekend. And thank you, Antonia. That was fascinating. Thank you.
I just put a link to a fantastic website if anyone's interested in
child ethics.
Lots of good resources.
Great. Thanks, Antonia.
Thank you.
We'll send you all the comments.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.